Welcome to Thuma Mina Teaching. Thuma Mina Teaching converts the South African school curriculum into captivating video lessons and distributes them free of charge on familiar platforms like Facebook and on YouTube. If you have a look at these platforms, make sure you check the description below. In the description you will find access to presentations and self-marking assessments that accompany the video lessons. In this particular session, we are going to tackle grade 9 history for term 2, which revolves around the Cold War. This session will consist of a few video lessons, and after every video lesson we are going to discuss some questions regarding that video lesson. So make sure that you have a pen or paper ready, or better, your social science workbook, as the video lessons are interactive and engaging. So quickly go and fetch that and be prepared for this session. So in the previous lesson we looked at the predominant powers during the Cold War, the USA and the USSR, and we looked at the term tension and what tension means and how tension was central during the Cold War. Then we moved over to ideologies and we looked at communism and capitalism, and we discussed both ideologies extensively. And in this lesson we are going to look at the end of the Second World War. We're going to look at the end of the war, as the end of the Second World War is the spark or the beginning of the Cold War, especially with what happened there. So let's start with the first inserted video lesson, and then we are going to discuss that video lesson just afterwards. So when we look at history, many times when we start something we look at the end of something else. And when it comes to the Cold War, we look at the end of the Second World War as that produces or leads into the Cold War. Now you'll remember in the first term you learned about the Second World War and that it was between the Allies and the Axis powers. So for the first couple of years, Nazi Germany ruled most of Europe. But in 1943 there was a turning point where the Allies started advancing towards Berlin. From the south, the Allies started with their Italian campaign. From the west, the Allies landed on the French coast, what we call D-Day. And from the northeast, Russia advanced after they defeated the Nazis at Stalingrad. All these forces moved towards Berlin, the epicenter of World War II. The Allies liberated Europe from the west and from the east. And the way they did it was completely different. As they moved from the west, the Allies would liberate these countries and give back those countries their own freedom. But from the east, Russia, when they liberated these countries, they enforced communist rule over these countries. This was a major problem for the USA, and they had to have several conferences to discuss this issue. The Yalta and the Potsdam Conference primarily looked at what they should do with the liberated countries of Europe. This is a very well-known photo taken at the Potsdam Conference of the Big Three: Winston Churchill, Harry S. Truman, and Joseph Stalin. At the Potsdam Conference, Stalin was informed of America's new weapon, the atomic bomb. So the Potsdam Conference ended on the 2nd of August, and only 4 days afterwards, America used their nuclear warfare, the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, they used it again on Nagasaki. This was a major shock for Stalin, because Stalin realized two things. Firstly, he's way behind America in terms of weapon technology, and secondly, America is actually prepared and willing to use this massive bomb in warfare. This new atomic bomb changed the landscape of warfare completely. And this brings me to today's keyword: nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapon is an explosive device that derives its destructive force from nuclear reactions. Okay, so let's look at the key takeaways from that lesson. Europe was liberated by mainly two powers, the USSR and the USA, and they moved from both sides, from the east and the west. Secondly, the way they liberated the countries and the policies that they followed while liberating them differed completely from the USA and the USSR. Then the two conferences, the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference, was held to discuss post-war Europe, and a lot of the conversations revolved around what should happen with the countries that were liberated from Nazi rule. And the last key takeaway from that lesson was the whole idea of nuclear weapons and the fact that the USA developed nuclear weapons and used it against Japan just after the Potsdam Conference, and how this changed the relationship between the USA and the USSR. Okay, so let's look at the first two takeaways from that lesson. It's important for me that you understand the first two, as it is so crucial. It sparked the whole Cold War. Let's do it by having this map behind me. I'm not going to discuss the weather. I'm just going to discuss how Europe transformed, or how Europe was changed by Nazi rule, the expansion of Nazi rule, and then the shrinking of Nazi rule, and how that influences the start of the Cold War. Okay, so there's a video going to play behind me, and this video is going to just show the map and how it expands and shrinks. We know that the Second World War started in 1939, and we're going to take 3 years of warfare, 4 years of warfare, and just play it in 30 seconds so that you can just get the idea of expansion throughout Europe and what the Nazi Empire was able to do, or what Hitler was able to do. Here we go, 30 seconds. Okay, let's stop there. It's 1943. At this stage, the early months of 1943, Hitler was at the height of his power. He basically dominated the whole of Europe almost. And at the end of 1943, the Allied powers shrunk his kingdom from the east and the west and the south, really. So let's look at the map. It's going to be the shrinking process from the eastern side and the western side and the southern side, and it's going to shrink up until Berlin. So let's take it from the end of 1943 till just before the end of the Second World War. Alright, so let's stop here. This is the time to evaluate and discuss, and it's a crucial part of the whole start of the Cold War. Okay, let's start. So, Europe was liberated from the east and the west. And just to make things easier, we can draw a line just to divide the two parts of Europe. So they shrunk the Nazi kingdom up until Berlin, and then the USSR took Berlin first. So you might ask, where's the crucial part? Where's the start of the Cold War? It's the way that they liberated the countries. If you look at the way, let's start with the USA and their allies, the way they liberated the western side of Europe is they drove the Nazis away, but then they gave the freedom to those countries to re-establish themselves, to get their own governments going and to form their own identity again. But the USSR had another agenda. When they liberated those countries, they had communist rule be established in those countries. So in a sense, all those countries became allied or allies with the USSR and fell under the USSR and became part of the USSR. So in a sense, the Soviet Union liberated them from Nazi rule, but established their own rule in those Eastern Bloc countries. So you can just imagine how much the USA was alarmed and agitated because of this reality, these countries where communism was imposed on these countries. And the USSR being a major threat for the USA, they were concerned about the amount of growth that they had in that period of time. So let's consolidate our knowledge. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions throughout the lesson. If you have your pen and paper ready, here comes question number one. Number one, which superpower is represented by this flag? The USSR. Question number two. Question number four, let's move over to the leaders. Who was the leader of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, during the Second World War, and during the start of the Cold War? Is it A, Winston Churchill, B, Joseph Stalin, C, Harry S. Truman, or D, Hirohito? The answer is... it is Joseph Stalin, one of the main figures, if not the main figure, of the Cold War. Why was there so much tension between the Soviet Union and the USA when countries were liberated that were previously under Nazi rule? Okay, two more questions and then we're going to insert another video lesson. Question number 6. Which characteristic is not a characteristic of communism? The answer is C. A society is not democratic in a communist regime. Okay, let's move over to question number 7. In this question, I would like to evaluate a political cartoon. Now, political cartoons are frequently used by teachers, history teachers in examination papers or tests, as it truly assesses what you understand of the subject matter. If you look at the following learning model, the Bloom taxonomy, it's basically just a framework of how you learn subject matter, and if you master all the areas, then you've really mastered the subject matter. And if you look at this model right over here, the bottom two, the remembering and understanding, that's the easy part, or the part that you are introduced probably at the beginning of a lesson, and then it moves over to higher levels of learning and thinking, and you would like to master every area, then you really understand the subject matter. So cartoons is a great way to test you, as it does not only test your understanding or if you remember what you've learned, it really tests if you can apply your understanding, if you're able to analyze and evaluate. So it really covers a wide spectrum on this learning model. So when you get a cartoon, stop, just evaluate and apply what you've learned and try to figure out what is the message of this cartoon. Let's move over to the cartoon. Here's our cartoon for today. So a good way to start is just to evaluate what you see, just to write down everything, bullet points. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Look at this political cartoon, jot down everything, all the information that you can gather from this political cartoon. Here we go, 30 seconds. Okay, let's see what we gathered from this cartoon. What I usually start with the information about the cartoon. And as you can see at the bottom of the cartoon, there's a date. When was this published? It was published on 16 June 1947. 1947, now you have to pause and think. What happened? What's the time era? We know that the Second World War ended in 1945. So we know that this source is published just after the Second World War. And that's important. Then we know where it was published. It was published in the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is a newspaper in the UK. Then you can look at the source of the cartoon where you can access it, as well as the author of the cartoon. So that's all the information that I like to start with. I want to get context of the source itself. Now we can go over to the cartoon. What do we see in this cartoon? Okay, first things first. It is a map of Europe, and we know that this map of Europe is the map of 1947. And there in the right hand corner of the map, there's a map legend. Now this is very important. The map legend gives you information, critical information about this map. And have a good look. It's categorized in different categories, and everything gives you information. So just have a good look at it. Then we see a person that stretches over from the east towards the west of Europe. And now we have to identify this person. How do we identify the person? We look at his face. And this face, you have to be able to identify the face. It's the face of Joseph Stalin. And it makes sense because he stretches over from Russia. Then we see that the action, what action is taking place? Joseph Stalin is stretching out and he's planting flags. And what flags are these? We have to know the symbol of these flags. We see it's a hammer and a sickle, and that is associated with communism, and it is a communist flag being planted. So we can already think about the message of this cartoon. Now there are probably more bullet points that we can put here, but let's just stop here and continue to question number 7. What is the central message of this cartoon? Is it A? The answer is B. Stalin is trying to expand his influence over Europe. Now, with a source like this, there are many questions that you can ask in an examination paper. So if you're watching this via YouTube in the classroom, I would suggest be ready to hit the pause button, because I'm going to give a couple of questions. And as the question is shown on the projector, make sure that you hit the pause button and discuss the question as we go along. Here are a couple of questions that can be asked with a source like this. Question number 7.1. Would this cartoon be published in a Russian newspaper? Why or why not? 7.2. The map legend includes countries not yet decided. What have they not yet decided? 7.3. List all the elements of this cartoon that suggests Russian expansion. 7.4. What groups would agree or disagree with the cartoon's message, and why? 7.5. Is the source a primary or secondary source? Motivate your answer. Okay, we are ready to move over to our next inserted video lesson. Here we go. You'll remember that the war did not end all at once. First, it ended in the European sphere and then in Japan. What did Europe look like just after the war? Europe was completely destroyed. Germany was in ruins, especially Berlin, that was taken over by the Red Army of Russia. Hitler committed suicide, and that ends the war in the European sphere. But the question is, why did Japan continue with the war? they were allies with Germany. Now there's something about the Japanese culture that we need to understand here. In the Japanese culture, it is very dishonorable to give up. You don't surrender. As a soldier, you would rather die than surrender. This dates back from the era in Japan where a samurai would rather kill himself before giving himself up to an enemy. Now, keeping this in mind, we look at Hirohito's response. Hirohito refused completely to give up. He would not surrender. The Allies' response to him was that Japan would experience immediate and complete destruction if they did not surrender. Unfortunately, they didn't, and the Allies pushed and took over two strategic islands under Japanese control, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with loads of people losing their lives in the process. Unfortunately, they still refused to give up. At this stage, America decided to use their new weapon, the atomic bomb, and on the 6th of August 1945, they dropped their first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. A couple of days after, they dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. One day later, Japan decided to surrender under one condition, that Hirohito would remain as their leader of Japan. Interestingly, between the prominent leaders of the Axis powers, Hirohito was the only leader to survive the Second World War. So Japan then surrendered, and the official document of surrender was signed on the 2nd of September 1945 on the USS Missouri warship. So this marks the end of the Second World War. Let's have a look at the world map at this stage. Remember, as I said previously, it was a world war, and I'm only talking about the prominent countries during the Second World War. America was still in a very strong position after the Second World War. England just survived the Second World War. France was one of the first countries to fall during the war, and most of Europe was in ruins, especially Italy and Germany. Russia suffered massive losses. They lost the most people during the Second World War. But seeing that the country is so large with so many people in it, the country was still relatively strong and standing. And Japan was broken with the atomic bombs that were deployed on them. So in summary, there were only two superpowers that remained standing after the Second World War, America and Russia. And this is where the tension starts building up between the two superpowers. Every now and then I would like to conclude with a little story, interesting story. As you remember, in the Japanese culture, it is dishonorable to surrender. And there were many soldiers that just didn't believe that Japan surrendered. Let me introduce you to Hiro Unada. He was the last person to surrender in the Second World War. He continued fighting for 29 years in the island that he was stationed in. He just completely refused to believe that Japan would surrender. So for today's keyword. Today's keyword is the word superpower. A superpower is a country with a dominant position in the world. The country is able to exert global influence, especially in an economic, military, and political field. Okay, so what were the key takeaways of this video lesson? The first key takeaway is that the Second World War ended in two spheres. It didn't end at the same time. It first ended in Europe, and then it ended in the Pacific Ocean. The use of atomic bombs hastened the end of the Second World War. And let's stop and think about this for a second. It definitely did, as Japan, they resisted surrender. They didn't want to surrender, and it was so dramatic that it quickly stopped the war, and we don't know how long it would have continued if the bombs didn't fall. And lastly, the only two major superpowers that remained standing after the Second World War were the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So let's move over to question number 8. We know that the prominent Axis powers during the Second World War were Italy, Germany, and Japan. And what I would like to know is who fell first and who fell last. Question number 9. The answer is true. They did want to end the war quickly, but they also wanted to send a message to the Soviet Union. And what message would that be? Firstly, it's the fact that they have these weapons. It's new weapon technology. And secondly, that they are actually prepared to use it in warfare. The answer is true. They were vulnerable. Why were they vulnerable? If you think about it, these countries were in ruin. They were not strong, and if you're not strong and you're weak, it's easier to be influenced. Okay, let's move over to the memo. Here's the 10 questions and the memo. See how you did out of 10. And then for the next lesson, we are going to take the USSR and the US and just measure them up against each other in the third broadcast lesson. We hope you benefited from this video lesson. Our vision at Thuma Mina Teaching is to accelerate access to quality education. And our dream is to see learners across South Africa flourishing academically. We are a non-profit company and we are entirely dependent on public support. We produce lessons at the rate at which they are funded. As soon as a lesson is funded, it is published to the entire growing audience of Thuma Mina Teaching. Please consider taking hands with us in one of the following ways. Share our content with others that can benefit from it. A great way to support us is to find us on My School and to add us as your beneficiary. And consider donating towards a lesson, or ask your company's CSI department to partner with us. We are a PBO, so your donation is tax deductible. Our contact details you'll find on our website www.tmteaching.co.za. If you want to reach out to us, please email us on admin@tmteaching.co.za.